We're lucky to have George Liebmann with us tonight. George is an attorney in private practice and an historian specializing in American and international diplomatic history. His publications include Diplomacy Between the Wars, 5 Diplomats, and The Shaping of the Modern World. Tonight, he's here to talk to us about his new book about U.S. Ambassador John Negroponte. Welcome, George. Thank you.
Thank you. The book is called The Last American Diplomat, not because John Negroponte was in any literal sense the last American diplomat, but because in some respects he's the last diplomat of a type and of a generation. He entered the Foreign Service immediately on graduation from Yale. His education was essentially in the humanities, not in international relations theory. He thought that the most valuable course he took in college was a course in economic geography, which is not taught anymore either in colleges or in high schools. He was required as a Yale government major to take a course in dealing with the English civil service. No one pays any attention anymore to English constitutional history. When he entered the Foreign Service, his first assignment was in Hong Kong in 1960. In Hong Kong in 1960, and it's hard to remember this, was a place that existed in almost total isolation from China. There were millions of refugees in Hong Kong, but no American could go to China, and there was no trade. It was a listening post, but not a very informative one. But the experience that he had there used to be typical of the experience that Foreign Service officers had. He was assigned to interview visa applicants. He learned at least rudimentary Mandarin Chinese, and it was undoubtedly a broadening experience for a graduate of Exeter and Yale to suddenly find himself interrogating impoverished and desperate people. And it is an experience which the denizens of Washington think tanks these days haven't had. And it produces, I would think, less certitude and more humanity than we see on the part of those who think that they are entitled to make foreign policy in Washington. I was not close to John Negroponte during that period. We grew up in the same apartment building. We were very close childhood friends until about the age of 10. We went off in completely different directions, and I didn't see him for 50 years. And I then saw him when my mother saw his mother's obituary in a newspaper when she was in her 80s. And she said, well, he was always a nice boy, and I have found that at my age, I wouldn't have any friends if I hadn't tried to renew old acquaintances, because they have a tendency to die off when you get into your 70s and 80s. So I looked him up. He was then outside of government at McGraw-Hill. And one thing led to another, and there came a time when we were having lunch when he said something that suggested to me that he might not be adverse to having someone write about his career, although he hadn't kept a diary and hadn't undertaken to write anything himself. And I thought, having written an earlier book about diplomats of the 20s and 30s, that his life would be a good way of telling the story of American foreign policy during the last 50 years, which is what I've tried to do in this book. His sojourn in Hong Kong, as I've said, was uneventful. The leading foreign policy issue with Hong Kong at that time concerned textile imports. the Kennedy administration was not happy at the volume of Hong Kong textile imports, and Kennedy complained to Prime Minister Macmillan about it. And Macmillan's answer was a very good one. He said, we used to have the same problem. We sold all this textile machinery to India, and India promptly took away our markets. And we decided the only thing to do about it was to try to educate our population so they could produce and sell other things, which in Britain's case was and is invisible exports: banking, insurance, law, accounting, academia, publishing, and so on, where the British still probably lead the world and almost certainly lead us. But with respect, this Hong Kong period was merely an interlude, and Negroponte, like most American Foreign Service officers during the Johnson administration, was then assigned to serve for a period in Vietnam. And he went to language school for 9 months and became, by most accounts, the second best Vietnamese speaker in the Foreign Service, which gives you some idea of how inadequate language training is in the Foreign Service. He had a gift for languages. He had grown up in a household where French, Greek, and English were spoken more or less interchangeably. But nonetheless, he was sent, his assignment for the first 2 years in Vietnam was to work with a group presided over by a famous diplomat named Philip Habib. And there was a group of about 8 or 10 Americans, the best known of whom was Richard Holbrooke, whose job was to go out into the Vietnamese provinces and make assessments of the political situation in each province. And these assessments were essentially the only objective assessments that anyone made at that time. The Defense Department people were fond of proclaiming that what they were doing was a great success and that prosperity was just around the corner. The people from the Agency for International Development, who devoted themselves to giving away rice, tin roofs, and cinder blocks, similarly were proud of the way they were winning the hearts and minds of the people. The State Department people didn't really have a dog in that fight. They were not delivering programs. They were just observing. And what they observed, and they were all pretty much in agreement about this, was that there were dramatic differences between the provinces in South Vietnam. And the most pronounced differences depended upon the religious composition of the population and how many of the people there had been refugees from the north. When the French got out of North Vietnam, there was a massacre of about 50,000 Catholics. And this was followed by a flight to the south of more than 1 million Catholics. And the United States played a considerable part in helping evacuate them to the south, which led Senator George Aiken, who was best known for his later recommendation that the United States should declare victory and go home, to pithily observe that no good deed goes unpunished, because the effect of having this very large northern population consisting mostly of Catholics in the South was to create a condition in which the government of the South was almost entirely in the hands of northern Catholics. And the provinces with a large Catholic population were pro-government. The provinces that didn't have a large northern Catholic population were at best neutralist, and you will recall the demonstrations by the Buddhists, the people immolating themselves, and so forth. So the recommendations of the Negroponte was a pessimist and a dove for the early part of his stay